I'm Kate Weller, Curator of the Schenectady County Historical Society. Thank you for joining us in our next podcast. This week, Bill Buell, reporter for the Daily Gazette, will be interviewing Phil Lord on New York's first canal system before the Erie Canal. Now, to hear more or learn more about this canal system, make sure to join us February 13th at 2 o'clock when Phil will be presenting here at the Schenectady County Historical Society. For more information on all of our upcoming programs, check out our website at www.schist.org. Again, that's www.schist.org. And to follow us on a regular basis, you can see us on Facebook as well as Twitter. Thank you.
Welcome. My name is Bill Buell. I'm a reporter with the Daily Gazette in Schenectady, New York. We are here today at the Schenectady County Historical Society talking to Philip Lord, retired curator from the New York State Museum, who is going to be here on February 13th to speak to the society. Phil, why don't we start by getting a little bit of your background. Where were you born and raised and that sort of thing?
Okay, well, I was born in Pennsylvania, but spent all my life in upstate New York, except for 4 years in Arizona. And my background really was in archaeology, and then when I went to Arizona, I taught in a community college for a while. Then I came back in '74 to work for the State Museum and did program management and historical research and environmental studies. And retired after 30 years, and now I teach at Hudson Valley Community College in sociology, so kind of had a finger in a lot of different things.
So where did you get your initial college degree from?
Well, I got my BA and MA both from SUNY in Albany.
Oh, in?
Well, in sociology with a minor in anthropology.
Did you always know this was something you wanted to do, or did you kind of stumble upon it?
Stumble's a good word. I can remember a point when I was reading a National Geographic article and they showed people doing field research. I think it might have been in biology or something like that. And I said, gee, how do you get a job doing that? And it wasn't very clear how I could do that. So I went into sociology with an idea of teaching, and then I drifted into history and archaeology. And when I started work at the State Museum, it turned out that was exactly the type of work I'd be doing. We were doing environmental studies on highway projects and canals, and I was out in the field doing the things I saw people doing in National Geographic a decade before. So in a way I did drift into it. It wasn't something I set up as a clear plan or goal, but it ended up happening.
Mm-hmm. And you worked at the museum for 30 years. What was your specialty, your field of expertise?
Well, it was archaeology initially, what they called highway salvage archaeology, which was the environmental studies for archaeological remains on interstate highway projects. And then I started doing program management in other historical programs like historic markers and geographic names. And started doing my own historical research that spun off from the research that we did for the DOT and other agencies, and ended up, in the last decade I was there, I ended up doing research on the Bennington battlefield, on the Mohawk River navigation, and some industrial sites out in Rensselaer County. And this had nothing to do with environmental impact. It ended up being kind of my own projects, my own initiative.
Did you, what kind of reaction did you have when you first moved to this area, the history, the historical sites that are in and around the capital region?
Well, it's certainly a very rich area, and unlike other areas like Boston or Philadelphia, it's probably misunderstood or understood. And we're sitting right here on one of the major international harbors in the world in the late 18th century. And yet, for most people, if you say that, they're not sure what you're talking about, because it was more or less eclipsed by the Erie Canal in the early 19th century. But this, right where our chairs are now, is one of the most historic spots in North America.
Let's talk a little bit about your presentation on the 13th. It's transportation on the Mohawk.
Right, it's basically the first canal age in New York State, which ran from 1792 to 1820. And what I'm going to do is basically take people on a journey from here, or from Albany, up the Mohawk River to Oswego eventually, and the Great Lakes, as it would have existed in, well, after the Revolution, like 1790. And then I'm going to go back and pick that same trip up in about 1795 after General Schuyler's Canal Company made the improvements which transformed the whole inland waterway passage so that you could now go from this spot in Schenectady on the Mohawk and go all the way to Oswego without getting out of your boat or dragging your boat overland as they used to do.
Just so people know, what were the problems between where the Mohawk goes into the Hudson and then westward that people would run into?
Well, the first problem is the Cohoes Falls, and basically you can't get from Albany to Schenectady by water until the Erie Canal comes along and bypasses it. And so any traveler going west in North America, except in Canada, which wasn't under our control, would come up to Albany from New York City and then would have 16 miles of a dusty road to get here. But once they were here, they would go into the harbor, which was right behind this building, and get into boats and head up the Mohawk. And then the Mohawk itself had, I think there were 91 rifts. Some people call them rapids, but they're really just shallows, places that are so shallow you could cross the river and only get wet up to your knees. And getting a boat up to Rome at the upper end of the Mohawk on a system like that was a challenge.
I've always thought it was fascinating how the river seems to have changed so much in 200, 300 years. Was it a lot wider and faster moving back then? Is that safe to say?
I don't know about fast, but it was wider and much shallower. Of course, a lot of it's been dredged out for the barge canal. In fact, you can't find, I'm trying to think, I don't think you can find a place in the Mohawk River now that was remotely like it was 200 years ago. And I took some pictures for my slide presentation to capture that essence of what the Mohawk looked like, and I had to go up West Canada Creek to get those pictures because you can't get anything on the Mohawk. It's been dredged and dammed and channelized, and it's just a whole different system.
Well, why didn't the Western Inland Navigational Company, did I say that right? Why didn't that work?
Why didn't it work? It did work. And in fact, if you want to raise my blood pressure, point me to the DOT's canal site or website, or point me to most textbooks about early transportation. And they come to that conclusion that it was a failure, it was an experiment, it didn't work. It worked perfectly. They were able by 1806 to have a large boat continuous passage from Schenectady to Oswego. And that was their intent. And it may not seem that significant to say a large boat continuous passage, but think of it like the thruway. Before the thruway, you took small vehicles on side roads and got there as best you can. It took a long time. Once the thruway was built, you could put a big double tandem tractor trailer on there and go 65 and be there in no time. So transforming this broken, obstructed inland navigation corridor that existed after the Revolution into a complete channel by their short canals and their other improvements was what I would call something that worked. It wasn't easy and it wasn't terrific, but it was completely functional. And strategically, if you think what 1806 is, it's the embargo, it's the closing of New York as a port, and now inland shippers, especially farmers shipping potash and things like that, could ship out to Kingston via Oswego, avoid the blockades. And then next you have the War of 1812, which we had to supply the Great Lakes from places like New York, and to supply a war effort on a broken, shallow navigation that only took small boats, and you had to drag them over land between sections of the river with oxen, we probably would have lost the war. So the reason we think it didn't work is because the Erie Canal worked so much better. Mm-hmm. And the Erie Canal eclipsed these early navigation improvements, which we have to see not in the light of the Erie Canal, but in the light of what was before. And Schuyler, as a general during the Revolution, was completely familiar with the adequacies and inadequacies of this, what I call the Mohawk-Oneida corridor. So that's why he was picked. At a time when most of us retired, he was picked to start a whole new operation, the first canal company in New York State.
And he died in...
1804, possibly, I think.
And was the company still going strong at that point?
The company went well strong. I'm not sure about strong. The company made its last major improvements out in Oneida County on Wood Creek in 1803. And they were big improvements, and they vastly improved that small stream, which was the link between the Mohawk and Oneida Lake.
So did it set the way or prepare the way for the Erie Canal then, or did they just start from scratch again?
The Erie Canal kind of overlooked the Mohawk-Oneida corridor that Schuyler had built, because the Erie Canal was intended to be a ditch dug entirely on dry land and then filled with water. His system used lakes, streams, natural waterways. He dug some short canals to connect waterways to improve areas of waterways that existed. But his longest canal was only a couple miles. So here you have somebody building a ditch from Albany to Buffalo that's entirely self-contained and has nothing to do with the river. So what happened was the Erie Canal started in Rome, and it started building in both directions in 1817, and then during the time where they were building, Schuyler's company's improvements were still in play. So you had an interesting time, which I would have loved to have been able to see, of when Durham boats, the big boats that were using this system, were going on the Erie Canal for maybe a day, and then they'd get out of the canal and back into the river. And so it was a mixed system, and when the canal was finally finished from end to end, some of the first boats through were the old Durham boats that were river boats. And that lasted a very short time because the canal allowed much larger boats, and so running a small boat, relatively small boat in a large canal didn't make any sense.
Let me ask you, what is a Durham boat?
A Durham boat actually originally is an ore boat from the Delaware River in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And it's a big open hole, double-ended, 60-foot long, 8-foot wide box. And it was poled. The center was filled with iron ore from the Durham iron mines. And it was poled down, to Philadelphia and then hauled back up. And it became famous because when Washington crossed the Delaware to attack Trenton, he had no way to get across except by those boats. So he formed a fleet of these basically trucks to bring him across, and that made his attack on Trenton successful.
Were some of them built in Schenectady?
Good question. They were some of these boats, these large boats, were called Schenectady boats, but it's not clear whether they're called that because they basically were based here in Schenectady or because they were built here. Bateaux were built here, the earlier smaller boats, by the hundreds. And so, but a Durham boat only had a function here once Schuyler finished his improvements. You couldn't take a 60-foot long boat anywhere on a system that would only tolerate a 30-foot long boat. And so once Schuyler completed the improvements, then these boats became very popular. I had discovered some information that suggests they actually started in the Finger Lakes. And a possible connection, if I worked another 30 years at the State Museum, a possible connection I might have come up with is that one of the boatmen that helped Washington cross the Delaware in New Jersey ended up living on the Finger Lakes, where we think these boats began. So he's looking at these boats that he experienced down there, and he's thinking, well, if we built those up on the Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes, we could take our produce down to Oswego. They wouldn't have to come to Schenectady. They could run from the Finger Lakes to Oswego, from Onondaga Lake with salt to Oswego. And they were great boats for that. So they may have been doing that before they actually arrived here. I know for a fact that some large boats, which were termed scows, used during construction of Schuyler's canals, were built here.
Did they become impractical with the canal, or were they used as well?
They were immediately made useless by the canal because they were small. They were 8 feet wide and 60 feet long, and I forget exactly what a canal boat of that period would have been, but quite a bit larger. So what happened, and we do have one letter from Schenectady, or half a letter from Schenectady, that tells us one thing that happened. what happened was they were sent up to Canada. And in Canada, on the Rideau River and Ottawa River and other places where they still had Mohawk River-like conditions, these boats were used up there. And they didn't ship the boats. These were actually Mohawk River boatmen and their boats. So they were like truckers who might live in Schenectady and then take their rigs out to Montana for the summer and move stuff back and forth on the west coast and then come back here when business was low. But the Durham boats, as soon as the canal opened, were an anachronism. They really didn't have much function.
Do we appreciate what a controversial issue the Erie Canal was? I'm remembering it might have been Madison or Jefferson said it was a bad idea. A lot of politicians didn't think it was going to work. I mean, looking back, it seems like a no-brainer, but if you were around in 1819, do you think it would have been a good idea? Or?
Well, there was discussion about building on Schuyler's initial idea of improving the natural waterways. But you've got all kinds of things that happened. Schuyler died, for one, and often these companies are driven by a leading person. The other thing is the company was going broke. What happened, they sold stock to support the company initially, but what happened was they built a lot of, in the experimental engineering, they built a lot of stuff out of wood. The original locks at Little Falls in 1795 were wood. And it was experimental. A lot of things they built, like in the river, they built wing dams to raise the water. They washed out every year. Mm-hmm. So what happened was they went back in about 1802, 1803 and rebuilt a lot of this stuff in stone. So when you're talking about the business venture, it's like you opening a store and you're doing kind of okay for 5 years and then somebody burns your store down and you have to build the whole thing up. Only now, instead of a nice little wooden store, you have to build this state-of-the-art masonry structure. And Schuyler's company was going broke. He also had a northern inland lock navigation company, which was equally a good idea, was to connect Albany with Lake Champlain. And they did build some things of the same scale, but it was too hard. The construction was too hard. And then when you get to Lake Champlain, what's the outlet? Canada. Mm-hmm. So it's a political situation where this put people into the Great Lakes, which was an American frontier, and the other canal company, while it might have had some profit, its outlet was into enemy country in the St. Lawrence. St. Lawrence is a better avenue to the Great Lakes, but it wasn't American, so there was no reason to develop it.
Was it imperative that public money be used to finance the canal?
Well, it was a private company, but the state bought a lot of the stock. And I think the Erie Canal, or you're talking about the Erie Canal, mm-hmm. The Schuyler's company was private, and I think that lesson taught them that the Erie Canal had to be a public project. You couldn't expect to sell stock and rely on income to build the thing. Plus, you're talking about a huge leap in scale from a few little canals here and there, some dams, some improvements, to a giant artificial ditch with locks, many locks, dams, feeders, going all the way across the state. Mm-hmm. So that type of thing had to be a government project.
Talk a little bit about the Benny Kill and what it looked like behind us in around the turn of the century in that era.
Well, basically, it's hard to do it on a map, but Benny Kill was what they call a sprout of the Mohawk. The Mohawk, coming in from the west, split up around a bunch of islands, and one major section came south and came up right alongside the stockade. And the main channel of the Mohawk ran along the west-north side. And the Binnykill, by being a right-angle slack water channel, was a perfect harbor because you pulled in out of the river and you had this quiet little backwater, and all along the edge of the Binnykill was an elevated ridge, which we're sitting on, and that meant you could have a nice clean landing. It wasn't a swamp. It wasn't anything that was difficult to get into. Warehouses were built along the frontage, and it was the major port. I mean, basically, when you think of the New York City, Albany, Schenectady, Rome, Oswego corridor to the Great Lakes, it was the only way to go other than Canadian waters. And it was thought that at that time Schenectady would be the major, inland port for the nation. And I'm sure there was a lot of distress. Well, first there was distress in 1819 when the whole place burned down. That's always
The Great
distressful.
Fire.
So, yeah, but they rebuilt. I mean, when you've got a business going and it's profitable, and your warehouse burns down, you don't just go home, you rebuild. So by the time the canal was essentially designed, there was a viable life in the port, but the problem was by the time the canal got here, they voted to go around the Binnykill Harbor and avoid it completely, not build into it in any way, which probably made sense from a design standpoint. But it put the place out of business, just the way the railroads did when they bypassed certain towns, and just the way the canal did. The Erie Canal made or broke towns in the 19th century by whether it went through them or around them.
When they had the Grand Parade in 1825 or 26, whenever it was, and DeWitt Clinton sailed down the Mohawk and to celebrations and all that kind of stuff, Schenectady wasn't really that involved emotionally with the celebration, and why is that?
I would imagine that they saw at that time that business was being undermined. I mean, they would have to be pretty insightful to see into the future and realize that it could be still viable on the canal, but it's just like the malls now. I mean, why stop at your local hardware store when you just keep the foot to the pedal for a couple more hours and you're in Crossgates? So basically, people coming down the channel would say, well, we could stop here in Schenectady, or, by supper time we'll be in Albany. And so that basically defined what Schenectady was from then on.
What is your class you're teaching at Hudson Valley?
Sociology. It's nothing to do with the canal, nothing to do with boats. Has somewhat to do with history and attitudes and values that society has about things, and there's sociology in this historical period too. But when I retired, I decided to switch gears. Well, I switched back to my original teaching was in '68 was sociology. So I convinced myself when I retired that basically I'd close the door on all this stuff and do something entirely different. But here I am talking about Durham boats. And
how often do you make presentations?
Almost never.
Oh.
This one coming up will be the second time in 5 years probably. The first one was out at a conference in Johnstown a while ago, which is where I was captured.
I have to ask you this. Do you canoe at all?
I used to kayak a lot.
Kayak. And have you been up and down the Mohawk in your kayak?
No, we were up and down the Mohawk in our full-scale bateau in 1993, 94. But kayaking is, I always preferred quiet backwaters. And I went out on the Hudson one time and, in total fear of the next tanker that was coming along. But I don't even kayak anymore because I had problems with it, my shoulder. So I stopped doing that.
So what do you do when you're not at Hudson Valley and not at a historical society?
Work on my model railroad and play with my granddaughter. What else do I do? Read books. Try to avoid speaking engagements wherever possible.
Do you have any books you want to recommend to us that cover maybe Schenectady or New York history, the canal history?
Well, this is the problem with this particular aspect of history is that nobody has focused on it. So the only book I would recommend is my own.
And that would be?
The Navigators, which was published by the State Museum in 2002 or 3, I forget. And what that was an attempt, this was after I retired, it was published, this was an attempt to actually bring together as much as I could in a reasonably priced paperback book my 13 years of research on this topic. And I used, as the backbone for that, I used the 1793 voyage of the Frenchmen going to what was called Casterland up in Watertown area. And so I followed them. They left Schenectady, well, they left Albany, went to Schenectady, got on a boat, went all the way to Oswego, came back down and went by land through the Indian Castle area out in Oneida County, where the Chief Shenandoah was still alive. And they've got some interesting observations there, have nothing to do with water travel. And then they get back down to Utica, they get back in boats, and they come back to Schenectady. And what I did was I used that voyage in 1793 as kind of a backbone to put some of my own research on. The reason that voyage is critical, the summer of 1793, is that the 1802-1803 mini canals, there were 13 of them built out in Wood Creek, out in between Rome and Oneida Lake, were under construction then, and they're very unusual. I found, archaeologically, I found most of them still intact out there. And they were all, strategically in different stages of construction when these guys went through. And so they make notes on each one and how it's being built. And, this is unique engineering. This is something that took a 20-mile twisting creek and turned it into shortened it by 6 miles and turned it into a navigable waterway that Durham boats could use, and did it in where nobody lived. It was swamps and uninhabited, not even Indians lived there. They did it with oxen and hand tools and boats, and in the end, this company in 1793 realigned Wood Creek and made it go where they wanted it to go. And this to me is a dramatic story. So the timing was good that the Frenchmen went to Casterland in 1793 because they saw all these works under construction. And it's very difficult to find documentation. I went through all Schuyler's papers and letters, and it's very ambiguous about what's going on. And nobody cared, nobody thought it was dramatic enough to do a history of it at the time, and nobody since has thought it was dramatic enough to do a history of it. And so it's really archaeological in the documentary sense as well as in the dirt and rock sense, because you have to excavate all these documents to find little tidbits of things so you can reconstruct what was done, which was revolutionary in its time, but has escaped the view of most historians.
Can you buy your book at the museum bookstore? The New York State Museum?
I think so. I think it's not sold out yet.
Do you have a favorite historic site in the capital region?
Does it have to be in the capital region?
No, it doesn't.
There's the first canal built in New York State was built, and it's hard to call it a canal, but the first canal type thing built in New York State, built in 1730 between Utica and Rome. Utica and Rome. And it shows up on a pre-Revolutionary War map of the route that we're talking about from Albany to Oswego. It shows up as a little loop in the river, and a little note says, "This neck digged through in 1730." And everybody's seen it. People have been looking at that map since the Revolution. And I looked at that and I said, well, that's interesting. It looks like a meander of the Mohawk was dug through for some reason. And I wondered where exactly it is, because this map is very abstract, so it makes the Mohawk look like it's straight except for this little blip. And after a great deal of research and documents on the ground, I found it and stood in it, and it's the first canal project in New York State, and it dates from 1730, which is...
What's there now?
Well, the barge canal and a channel relocation of the Mohawk cut through it but the actual loop is there with a slice through it, and the actual spot they dug through is still there. But you would have to practically be a psychic to see it because it's so subtle, and if you didn't know what you were looking for and hadn't spent months researching where it was and what it was, you wouldn't see it. But interestingly, it's on the Mohawk Bikeway, and they put up a marker there so people that bike by can see what it's like. But that's, I think, my favorite site because I like discovering things that nobody else knows about, and that was very early, and because my interest in canals was rampant at that point, I thought, well, this is the first one, and so I think if you want to extend the capital region to Utica, that's okay
We
with
can
me.
do that. Before I get done, I just wanted to ask you about the images for your presentation. Where did you collect all of them?
Some of them are from documents of the time period. Some of them are images that I took in the field. Some of them are images that I created, for instance, showing how those little mini canals were dug in Wood Creek. And some of them were just borrowed from the internet, Google Images. You know, I needed something generic to show, for instance, the War of 1812, so I could pull things in. And some of them are interesting. There's one of the most interesting is a calendar illustration from Canada, Canadian insurance company, showing a Durham boat going through a stone lock. It's actually a Canadian stone lock, but of the exact same design, same time period as the ones that Schuyler built out on the Mohawk. And it took me half a year, because the company went out of business. It took me half a year to find the remnant of that company and another month to get permission to use it. But it's a wonderful image because even though it's an artist's reconstruction, it captures what these things were like. At a very small scale. I mean, you're talking about a boat 8 feet wide, and you're talking about a canal lock that probably at most is 10 feet wide. And is this room? It's way bigger than 10 feet.
Right.
So, I mean, you're talking about something tiny. And yet, to be able to run that through without stopping all the way up to Oswego was a major breakthrough. And double the size of the boats. These little bateaux here are 30 feet, so it went to 60 feet. These carry at most 1.5 tons, and the Durham boats carried 12 to 13 tons. And so the cost of operation and value of merchandise is cost per ton per mile.
How many different images in your presentation?
Lots. I mean, it's a PowerPoint presentation with I would use only images if I could. And I teach sociology the same way. That I feel an image will stay with someone much longer than a description. And so I've got tons and tons. I don't know how many, hundreds.
Phil Lord from the New York State Museum, retired. Thanks for spending some time with us today.